Following Monday's attack in St. Petersburg, 6 people have been arrested on suspicion of recruiting others to commit extremist crimes. They all came from Central Asian countries that once were part of the Soviet Union, and it's not clear if they are connected to the bombing. The suicide attacker behind the metro bombing is also from Central Asia, the country of Kyrgyzstan. Other attacks in recent years also have a connection to that country. One of 3 suspects in the Istanbul airport attack last June was from there as well. And the 2013 Boston Marathon bombings were carried out by the Tsarnaev brothers, Chechens who grew up in Kyrgyzstan. And joining me now from Paris is Mike Kay, a former senior official in the Royal Air Force who has done 10 years of duty, included in Iraq and Afghanistan. He is now a filmmaker and journalist who spent time there in September 2014 researching the rise in radicalization there, especially among young people. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, DeMarco.
All right. Is the predominantly Muslim Central Asian states like there a prime recruiting ground for Islamic militants?
I think the country of Kyrgyzstan isn't very well known to Americans. It sits literally on the border with China. It's just above Tajikistan. It's just below Kazakhstan. And so the nearest sort of hotbeds, if you like, to this country are Pakistan and Afghanistan. It sits well away from Chechnya and the North Caucasus region, which is historically where Russia has had its problems with. So it was my producer, a gentleman called Joe Stromowski, in 2014, at the end of it. He had the idea of going over there because there were a few issues, including sort of radicalization, and kind of trying to understand how radicalization might spread east, as well as the obvious going through Turkey and into Europe. And what we found was quite interesting. During the Soviet Empire, Muslims within inside Kyrgyzstan weren't allowed to go to Medina or Mecca in Saudi Arabia, which is traditionally where most Muslims go to pay homage or their pilgrimage. So they had to go to a mountain called Mount Suleiman, and the Prophet Suleiman is thought to be buried inside this mountain. So that's where they had to go in a very secular Soviet Union. That's now changed. And when we went there and we spoke to the elder generation were very welcoming. They spoke to us about what their beliefs were. All of them did believe in Sharia law. And I think what we need to understand is that there are various interpretations of Sharia law when it comes to what the faith is. Some are quite conservative. I mean, if you look at Saudi Arabia, Sharia law is incredibly conservative over there, bordering on extreme. But if you look at other interpretations, like in Kyrgyzstan, the elderly were quite were quite welcoming. When I spoke to some of the youth, and it's not all of the youth, when I spoke to some of the youth, and even the elderly people in Kyrgyzstan, they identified some of these radical strands. And in 2014, no one had really heard about Kyrgyzstan. But now what you're hearing is, when you look at the Ataturk bombings, there was a Russian, an Uzbek, and a Kyrgyz involved in that. And now this latest in St. Petersburg, the suspect is again from Kyrgyzstan. So I think there is certainly something where we need to be looking at radicalization, not just spreading to the West through Europe, but also the way that it's affecting, as you say, these previous Soviet Union countries.
So what can you tell us about the ideologies of those that are radicalized in the Caucasus, like Chechnya and Kazakhstan, as well as the former Soviet territories in Central Asia, like Kyrgyzstan?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. One thing that I've known, I studied radicalization for 6 years now. I've literally just come back from West Mosul. One thing that we do know is that the people like the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, they breed off injustice. They breed off resentment. They breed off places which have a lack of governance. They breed off social dispositions, so poor socioeconomic surroundings, and they breed off what they see in terms of foreign policy. So there's a number of different factors which boils down to why we're seeing this metastasization of the ideology. But I think when it comes to the North Caucasus region, it's interesting because pre-Sochi, the Olympic Games, the Winter Olympic Games in 2014, Putin and his government clamped down significantly on the Caucasus Emirate, the jihadists that were in the North Caucasus region, fighting back against the Putin government. Now, what Putin exploited here is that obviously the rise of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria was pulling fighters from the North Caucasus region into those areas. And he effectively gave a porous border for them to disappear, which kind of has alleviated the problem slightly. But I think what you're going to see now, DeMarco, is that as we see progression by the government of Iraq and coalition in places like Mosul, and we're just about to see the affront on Raqqa, as the Islamic State loses territory, the Iraq and Syria is going to be no longer a breeding ground for these terrorists to be able to sort of succeed and metastasize. So I think what you're going to see is you're going to start to see those, the Chechens, the jihadists, starting to come back to where they originally came from. and starting to cause trouble. And I know certainly from speaking to a lot of intelligence sources, that is a big problem that they're anticipating.
All right, a final question for you, Mike. Do you see the situation getting worse, and what can be done to stop this radicalization?
I was in Kyrgyzstan last week, and I was speaking to one of the Kurdistan intelligence chiefs, and I asked him that very question. I said, there are lots of battlefield successes going on at the moment in West Mosul, and likely in Raqqa as the SDF and the coalition go and take back territory there. I said to him, what happens next? And his answer wasn't what I expected. His answer was that he is expecting mayhem. He's preparing his counterterrorism group right now for operations in Hawija, because he thinks that what we see in Raqqa and Mosul is just going to go underground. There are going to be sleeper cells that go underground in Iraq, in Syria. They're going to go underground in Turkey, and then you're going to see the metastasization in Europe. So I think what we're seeing at the moment in terms of foreign policy, in terms of the 13 billion being spent on an air campaign in Iraq and Syria, that's all very well and good. But I think where the investment and where the eyes need to go is back on domestic intelligence. Start looking where the sleeper cells are going to pop up, start looking at the intelligence and start bolstering the domestic security services. America is quite unique. America's got the Atlantic Ocean, so geographically it's well placed in terms of ameliorating that threat. But in terms of Europe, in terms of Turkey, in terms of Russia, they're on the doorstep.
All right, Mike, thanks a lot for breaking it down for us. Mike Kay, thank you.
Good talk.